Welcome to the Jerome McClain Show. I'm your host, Jerome McClain, and let's get into our episode.
Intelligentsia, the endem of sarcasm, the nutty professor to your whack-ass marmalade. It's T-Bone from T-Bone and Chick Brew in the morning. Now available in podcast format. Simply search for the T-Bone and Chick Brew podcast, available wherever fine podcasts are sold.
And welcome to the Origins Podcast. I'm Lawrence Krauss. What's left to say about Noam Chomsky? He's known throughout the world as perhaps the most important living public intellectual, and his writing has been cited more than almost any author in the arts and humanities over recent decades, and he's literally the father of modern linguistics. Noam served as a role model for me since I took a class from him in U.S. foreign policy while doing my PhD in physics at MIT, and I watched him speak throughout Cambridge with generosity and intelligence. We did a dialogue on stage 3 years ago for the Origins Project, and we discussed a host of things from language and consciousness to politics. That was before Donald Trump and Brexit and all that, however, and I was happy to have the opportunity to update our dialogue. As always, he was incisive, informative, provocative, and brilliant, as well as providing a unique treatment of issues one simply does not hear discussed in the U.S. media, making it incredibly important to hear from him today. Patreon subscribers can find the full video of this program immediately at patreon.com/originspodcast. I hope you enjoy the show. Noam, it's great to have you back here. You and I had one of my favorite conversations before the public, I think 3 years ago now. It's
3 years.
I think it seems, it's hard to believe, but I time it by knowing that it was before Trump was elected. Because it seems that's what's amazing. In 3 short years, it seems like so much has happened. And so many
BT and
AT, that's right, exactly. And but that's not just all Trump. I mean, all the things happening. There's what's happened in North Korea and Syria and Israel and Venezuela and Brazil.
All over.
It's just amazing that what seems to have happened in those 3 years, and even in our own countries. There's free speech debates. There's all sorts of things, and I'll want to talk about some of that. But at the same time, the more things change, the more they remain the same. So there's all sorts of new issues, but the underlying causes and impact may not be so different. I wanted to, and when I was thinking about that, I was looking at what we said to each other, and then I was reminded of a book I had been reading recently, which is an old book from the 1960s by Richard Hofstadter called Anti-Intellectualism in America, and it was interesting for me to read that because it was written in response to McCarthyism. It was written in 1961 or so, and I thought I'd begin to put this in context in a quote at the beginning of that book from 1961, where he quoted Emerson, who wrote, "Let us honestly state the facts. Our America has a bad name for superficialness. Great men, great nations have not been boasters and buffoons, but perceivers of the terror of life and have manned themselves to face it." So I thought I'd ask you to comment on that, and then we can move into recent politics.
Well, Emerson was a very interesting thinker, but in many respects, he unfortunately illustrated the things that he's criticizing.
I agree.
So take, for example, something not irrelevant today, his attitude toward the Civil War. At the very beginning, he was a pacifist. In fact, he was, in a sense, in favor of the war. He thought it would break down the states. It would break down state power, so maybe it would be beneficial. After the Battle of Bull Run, he became an enthusiastic super patriot, very much the way intellectuals do all the time. As soon as the conflict begins, we're enthusiasts for our own side. Mm-hmm. In fact, if you look back at the transcendentalists, his group. Some of the most distinguished intellectuals in the United States, certainly, maybe anywhere. One didn't go along with the tide, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and he was kind of excluded. In fact, there's a very interesting article you might want to read if you haven't, in the Atlantic Monthly. Hawthorne, towards the end of the war, about 1864, decided to just travel through the South to see. By then, the outcome of the war was reasonably clear. And he wrote an article which was supportive of the North, but skeptical. For example, he interviewed Southern prisoners of war in a fairly sympathetic way. He said, look, these are just rural farmers. They're not war criminals. They were brought up to defend their homes and so on. We should treat them decently. Anyway, the interesting thing about the article is not only his commentary, which is interesting, but the interpolations. The editors agreed to have it published, but only if they were allowed, and this is the liberal intellectual journal, if they were allowed to interpolate comments criticizing what he wrote along the way. So there you have Hawthorne's moderately sympathetic view to people who are defeated and suffering, and the liberal intellectuals interpolating, so no, you have to be a super patriot. You can't say these things. It's very instructive about intellectual history in many ways. In fact, if you look at the history of intellectuals, it works very much like this. So shortly after this period came the Dreyfus trial, which actually is the first time that the word intellectual starts being used in its modern sense. And it's very interesting that today we honor the Dreyfus arts, Emile Zola and so on. Not then. They were bitterly attacked by the immortals of the Académie Française. How dare you, mere writers and artists, criticize our grand institutions, the state, so on. Fast forward, Zola actually had to flee the country. Well, let's go forward to not long before we met, late 60s, 66, 67, roughly then. McGeorge Bundy, former Harvard dean, a leading intellectual, national security advisor for Kennedy and Johnson, had an article in Foreign Affairs, the main establishment journal, in which he said, he discussed the criticism of the Vietnam War. He said, yes, there are legitimate criticisms about the tactics and so on. And then there are what he called the wild men in the wings, people like Hawthorne and Zola, who are not only criticizing the tactics, but are raising questions about our motives.
I assume you were one of the wild men in the wings.
Absolutely, very far out in the wings. And this is a theme that runs through basically all of history. You go back to classical Greece, who drank the hemlock, the guy who was corrupting the youth of Athens by asking too many questions, right up to the present. And so it's interesting to raise the question of Emerson, who was a very distinguished, honorable figure, but not immune.
Well, no, I like that quote because of the many-sided aspects of it, because of his background, and also this notion, of course, great nations have not been boasters and buffoons, which sort of resonates in some ways in the current times. But this idea of whether anti-intellectualism it has been prevalent and to what extent it's good or bad.
It's a good question. So, for example, there are several kinds of intellectuals. There's the wild men in the wings, and there are what are sometimes called the stenographers of power. And one has to make up one's own mind, but I think you can certainly have different attitudes towards them.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Has anybody ever told you you were over-opinionated? How about this one? You can talk about everything you like, but don't talk about religion. Don't talk about faith. Don't talk about politics. My name is Jerome McClain. This is the Jerome McClain Show, and I want to introduce you to a show called Over Opinionated, Josh Scott. Judge has always been told he has been over-opinionated. He always tried to hold back these opinions, but he tried to back them up when he had to say something with facts and logic. Since he's grown up in many ways, he had to change a lot of his views and his opinions, as a lot of people should. He's not a millionaire from Fox News or CNN. He's just a hard-working, blue-collar type of guy. Give Josh Scott a shot at Overopinionated with Josh Scott. You can find him on patreon.com/overopinionated at 679. You can also check him out on Twitter at NRV_guy79. Overopinionated with Josh Scott, where he is this soft-spoken guy telling you the truth.
We talk about a lot of serious topics on this show. One very serious topic is women's health. One company that stood out to me was vslay.com, because the owner is very transparent about her own struggles in the women's health department and has great customer service, great deals, and frequent sales. You can check her out, her great customer service, products about women's health, and frequent sales at www.vslay.com. That is www.vslay.com.
Well, you know, we were talking about lunch that I learned from you when the first time we met, which was when I was sitting in a course in American foreign policy when I was a student at MIT. A shocking fact, which to me just surprised me, because I'd always kind of revered academia, and it's been a part of my life ever since. But the realization that in some ways during the Vietnam War, the last group to accept the immorality of that war were the academics, which I always thought, maybe because I knew about you, but I'd always thought somehow the academics were leading it. But it was the students, it was the public. Maybe you can go into a little bit.
Well, I would broaden it beyond academics to the general intellectual community. With some exceptions, there always are the Emil Zolas and the Nathaniel Hawthorne
and the Noam Chomskys
and others. But by and large, it's true. In fact, you get a kind of a vivid picture of it. Well, first of all, remember that opposition to the war was very late in coming. The war actually started in the early 50s. By 1960, maybe 60 or 70,000 people had been killed in South Vietnam just by the repressive government we were supporting. Kennedy escalated the war in 1961 and 62. He authorized the U.S. Air Force to start bombing rural South Vietnam under South Vietnamese markings, but nobody was fooled. Authorized napalm, began, and this was very serious, chemical warfare to destroy crops and livestock, to try to drive the rural population into concentrated areas called strategic hamlets, where they were being protected against the guerrillas who the U.S. government knew very well they were supporting. We know this from internal documents that have been released. There was no protest, none. In fact, just to give you an example, when 1965, I guess, I was 64, 65, I happened to be spending a year at Harvard as a visiting fellow in the Cognitive Science Center. February 1965, the war against South Vietnam had already half destroyed the country, but the U.S. escalated the war to the north. And the individual who was primarily responsible for this was McGeorge Bundy, nationalist, you recall, after Pleiku and so on. A couple of students, Bundy was being had been invited to be the commencement speaker at the June commencement for Harvard. And a couple of students initiated a very mild petition asking whether it's right to invite someone who's just launched a war against another country without provocation. Since I was there, they asked me to see if I could get some faculty signatures. Virtually impossible. That was 1965. By that time, the war was already far advanced. In fact, in October 1965, there was an international day of protest. You were probably in elementary school at the time, so you didn't know about it.
Yeah, I was still in elementary school and in Canada, which also made it.
But it was an international day of protest.
It's interesting because, 60, so this was 65. Yeah, because one thinks of the protests as being later, of course, but already, and maybe the American media, maybe you're going to get
what happened is interesting. I'm talking about Boston, maybe the most liberal city in the country.
Yeah.
We decided to try to have a demonstration in Boston to join the international demonstrations.
Uh-huh.
We went to the Boston Common, the standard place for. I was supposed to be one of the speakers. Totally broken up by counter demonstrators, mostly students, incidentally, coming to smash up this demonstration. The Boston Globe, maybe the most liberal paper in the country. You look at the front page the next day, it was denouncing the demonstrators. How dare you, very much like the mortals of the Académie Française, how dare you attack our noble institutions and so on. This is October 1965. By then, there was another international day of protest in March, I think, 1966. We decided we can't have a public meeting. We'll have a meeting in the church, Arlington Street Church. Church was attacked. Mm-hmm. At that time, Vietnam had literally almost been destroyed. Just to give in Bernard Fall, who was the most respected military historian, Vietnam expert, no dove, incidentally, but cared about the Vietnamese. He wrote at that time that he doubted that Vietnam would survive as a cultural and historical entity under the most serious attack that had ever been launched against an area that size, words roughly like that. That was at the point when in the liberal city of Boston, we couldn't have a demonstration in a church without it being attacked. Well, after that, finally, an opposition movement developed, mostly young people, students, and so on. But let's fast forward up to 1975, when the war ended. As soon as the war formally ended, of course, everyone had to write about it.
Yeah.
What did it mean? And you look across the spectrum of public expressions, public media, major media, and they kind of break up into the hawks and the doves. So roughly, the hawks saying, we were stabbed in the back, we didn't fight hard enough, if we'd fought harder, we could have won, and so on. The doves are always much more interesting. They set the kind of limits of possible thought. This far, but not a millimeter farther. So you go way to the end, say Anthony Lewis of the New York Times, strong critic of the war, civil libertarian. A very interesting article. He said the war began, he said, with blundering efforts to do good. Blundering because it didn't work, to do good because that's a tautology. You don't give arguments for that. That's kind of like saying 2 + 2 = 4. He's not a wild man in the wings. So they said by 1969, it was clear that it was a disaster. We could not bring democracy to Vietnam at a cost acceptable to ourselves. So it was really a terrible mistake. Now, up to the present, about as far as you can go to the critical side is to say it was a mistake. Very interestingly, at that point, public opinion was being carefully sampled. The Chicago Council on Foreign Relations does extensive studies of public opinion, very scholarly. Their 1965, 66, roughly then, their report also, of course, asked questions about what you think about the Vietnam War, and the answers were interesting. About 70% of the population said it was not a mistake, it was fundamentally wrong and immoral. Now, that question kept being asked for another 15 years or so, up to about roughly 1990. The answers were all approximately the same. They stopped asking it after a while. The last time they asked it, the distinguished social scientist, serious social scientist who was in charge of the surveys, John Reilly, asked the question in the comments, what do people mean when they say this? And he said, well, what they mean is too many American lives were being lost. Well, that's possible. Would have been possible to find out by asking another question.
Exactly.
But the other possible answer, namely, they meant what they were saying, is just unthinkable.
Totally discounted.
This is the history of intellectuals.
Well, okay, and we'll come back to that because I want to circle around to that eventually in a different context. But let's, and one of the reasons I was happy to start with historical perspective is, of course, it's always good to look at the present in that context. I was just reading what is now one of my favorite quotes of Mark Twain, who said that history may not repeat itself, but it sure rhymes a lot.
Yeah.
And I want to talk about, in that context, what's happening around the world, both what's really happening and the perceptions of what's really happening, from domestically to foreign wise. We could talk for hours about that, but we'll see if we can limit this.
Okay.
But let's pick what's going on. You pick your favorite. We could start with Venezuela. We could start with North Korea. We could start with Israel or Trump. I want to sort of go through these and see what we're hearing and what's really there, because this notion of American exceptionalism, which seems to be so prevalent, part of it is the notion, which again brings me back to when I first met you, to this notion that somehow the United States is different because we always want to do good. Other countries have been imperial powers, but their intentions were not to do good. And I remember you saying at the time that if you asked a 5-year-old, is it likely that America's foreign policy is governed by anything different than anyone else throughout all of history, they'd say it's unlikely. But somehow the perception is that intentionality is that the United States really is altruistic, and its interventions around the world, which may have had bad consequences, were really well intended, but they were misplaced. And I still kind of see that in the interpretation of much of what's going on. So,
well, blundering efforts to do good.
Yeah.
And notice that the 5-year-old who you invented agreed with 70% of the population at the end of the Vietnam War. So let's take today's newspapers.
Yeah. Okay.
There's an article by David Sanger in the New York Times, one of the leading security analysts.
Yeah, sure.
It was an article about how to deal with the Russian aggression, the new forms of Russian aggression and intervention, and there's some interesting lines in it. So, for example, there's a sentence, not just somewhere in the middle, nothing special, saying it's about time for, he's quoting somebody positively as saying, it's time for NATO to enhance its defensive capacities at the Russian border. Does that strike anyone as funny? I mean, is the Warsaw Pact enhancing its defensive actions at the Mexico border?
Yeah.
Well, no, we're exceptional. If we happen to have forces at the Russian border, that's because it's defensive. If we have ABM installations at the Russian border, which do actually have dual-use capacities.
Of course.
And there's an article in the Bulletin, The Atomic Scientist, the lead article by Theodore Postel recently pointing that out.
Yeah,
and
sure.
even if they're defensive, that's a first strike weapon.
Of course. It's one of the concerns, as being involved in the Bulletin for a long time. That's what I've been concerned
and
with.
We have them there, as President Obama said, in order to protect Europe from Iranian missiles, which don't exist.
Exactly. That always amazed me about this notion that we were protecting Europe from missiles that don't exist, whereas it just so happens that we're also
defensive. At the Russian border.
At the Russian border, it so happens they're pointing at the potentially at the exactly. If I were,
but you won't see a comment about this, I'm sure, because it's kind of common sense.
And then, when you say that, of course, one thinks about whether maybe putting missiles in Cuba might have been defensive.
Well, in fact, it was. There's very good scholarship on this by now, and it's pretty well agreed by mainstream scholarship what the reasons were for Khrushchev to make this very reckless move. There were basically two. One was just what you said. The United States was carrying out a major terrorist war against Cuba, a very serious terrorist war.
Sure.
And if the Russians may not have known the details, but they certainly roughly knew what was going on. Certainly Cuba did. In August 1962, Kennedy issued a national security memorandum which called on the terrorist operations, Operation Mongoose, to be enhanced, leading to an effort to create an insurrection in Cuba, which would lead to U.S. intervention in October 1962. Well, that's when the missiles went in. I don't think Castro and Khrushchev read the internal documents,
unlikely.
But you could see what was happening on the ground. That's one reason. There was another. In Khrushchev, when he took office, recognized something pretty obvious, that Russia could not compete economically with the United States. The United States is far more advanced. In fact, Western Europe alone counterbalanced Russia easily, let alone the United States and Canada. So what he urged was a reduction, a mutual reduction in offensive weapons in order to allow Russia to move towards economic development. The Kennedy administration considered this, rejected it, and instead, though they knew they were way ahead militarily, launched the biggest arms buildup in history.
Yeah, it was a very, exactly.
And shortly after this, one of the reasons for Khrushchev's placing the missiles in Cuba was to try to somehow minimally balance this. Notice, incidentally, that there was a crucial issue that almost led to nuclear war. The United States was surrounding Russia with missiles with nuclear weapons, of course. That's like our defensive behavior at the Russian border, including missiles in Turkey, Jupiter missiles in Turkey. And Kennedy actually didn't know about this. He made some comment to McBundy saying it's as if we had missiles in Turkey, and Bundy said, well, Mr. President, turned out they were obsolete missiles. A withdrawal order was already in process because they were being replaced by essentially invulnerable Polaris submarines, so much more lethal and invulnerable. So they were being replaced. They're obsolete. Khrushchev put missiles in Cuba to sort of try to nowhere near balance, but to compensate slightly for the overwhelming U.S. advantage and its refusal to, not only refusal to go along with his offer to reduce missiles, weapons, but even enhancing them. Through the crisis, as you recall, this issue of the missiles in Turkey became critical. October 27th, peak moment of the crisis, Khrushchev actually wrote a letter to Kennedy saying, let's get out of this before we blow the world up. We'll remove the missiles from Cuba, you remove the missiles from Turkey, we'll do it publicly and it'll all be over. At that time, Kennedy's subjective estimate of the probability of nuclear war was reported to be about a third to a half, not utterly outlandish. Hideous. He refused. This is considered his, and then Khrushchev basically backed down. So they made a kind of a secret agreement, but nothing public.
A secret agreement.
The meaning is we have a right to keep on the Russian border obsolete missiles, which we're replacing by even more lethal ones, but they don't have a right to have anything anywhere near us. Very similar to today. So we have the right to enhance our defensive capabilities on the Russian border, which are already enormous. But if the Russians dare to send anything to Venezuela, we're going to blow the world up. History rhymes.
Exactly.
And it's useful to think about it.
Yeah, well, in fact, it's a nice segue. I'm glad because I was going to go to Venezuela. But at the same time, it's also worth mentioning that in terms that the United States also was very, by that point, I think it had subsided. But the United States, especially during the period of extreme military superiority, were very seriously considered first strikes in order to.
We've never renounced first.
Yeah, we've never renounced first strikes. Most people don't realize that we still have that. We've never said we won't strike first. But at the time there were serious discussions of a real first strike in order to before Russia or the Soviet Union was able to catch up. And
well, Dan Ellsberg's book, which I'm sure you read.
Well, that's later on my list. But yeah. In fact, I read it because of you, so I want to come back to that. Okay. So we'll come back. But I think you made the perfect segue because I wanted to hit Venezuela. In this concept, I mean, here we are trying to quote unquote, at least if you read the papers, do good in Venezuela. Whether it's blundering or not. So I would like to hear your perspective of our doing goodness in Venezuela.
Well, what we're doing in Venezuela is imposing extraordinarily harsh sanctions, which are cutting off virtually the entire income of the country and strangling the population. The population's opposed to the sanctions. The leading economist of the opposition, a serious economist, Francisco Rodriguez, one of the most serious commentators on this, he's opposed to the sanctions. He says they're turning a serious problem into an utter catastrophe. But we keep doing it because we're trying to do good. We want to put into power our own guy, Guaido. Nothing much is known about him except that he's a strong supporter of the neo-fascist Bolsonaro, who was just installed next door in
Brazil. We'll get to Brazil.
That's another story.
Yeah.
So there are all kind of criticisms of the Maduro government, which are quite legitimate.
Yeah, I was going to say one should criticize. I mean, that government is not.
I think it's very repressive. It's carrying out horrible economic policies. A lot wrong with it. But why do we have the right to impose the government of our choice by strangling the population into submission?
Well, there's nothing new there. I mean, that's what we try and do in Iran, right? I mean,
we're doing the same thing in Iran.
I mean, the idea is who's getting hurt by sanctions in Iran?
Well, the population. But what right do we have to do that? In fact, you could ask the same question about China. It's taken for granted across the board. I can't find an exception that it's legitimate for the United States and Europe, in fact, mostly the United States, to try to impede China's economic development. They're moving forward. They're trying to move forward with a particular form of economic development. Say, we don't like the way they're doing it, so we'll try to block their economic development. Is that legitimate? In fact, there are other questions. The sticking point in the negotiations right now, according to Trump, is intellectual property rights. They are not observing intellectual property rights. What that means is exorbitant patent restrictions, radically opposed to free trade, built into the World Trade Organization system to protect U.S. corporations. So we want Bill Gates to be the richest man in the world, so therefore there's essentially monopoly for Windows. Pharmaceutical prices have to go out of sight, so therefore there's huge patent restrictions on for pharmaceuticals. Suppose China decided not to observe them. Who suffers? Well, Bill Gates will have a little less money. Users of computers will be able to find better programs than Windows. Pharmaceutical corporations, instead of having trillions of dollars, will only have a few trillions. People will be able to buy cheaper drugs. I mean, it's argued that this would cut back innovation, but if you look into it, that's not the way innovation takes place. Take, say, Windows. I mean, I don't have to tell you, the development of computers, software, internet, and so on, that was all most of it at taxpayer expense for decades. In fact, the same with pharmaceuticals. There's a good reason why if you walk around MIT, you see you see Pfizer, Novartis, they're all there kind of feeding off the creative scientific work done at the laboratories, mostly at government expense. If you'd gone back, their 50 years ago, you would have seen Raytheon.
When I was a student there, those were the big...
And that's because electronics was kind of the cutting edge of the economy.
Yeah.
Now it's biology. So,
yeah.
And this is at every research university in the country, not just MIT.
Sure.
So going back to China and the intellectual property, why should they observe the intellectual property rights which are rammed through by the United States and other rich countries? Now let's look at a little history. How did England develop? By stealing technology from more advanced countries like India or the Low Countries, even Ireland. How did the United States develop? By stealing technology from England. That's why we got a textile industry, steel industry, and so on. Of course, it wasn't called stealing then. It was just, that's the way it developed. Every single developed country is developed that way. Then comes something that economic historians call kicking away the ladder. At first you climb the ladder, then you kick it away so nobody else can do it. Well, that's kind of what lies behind all of this, lies behind the effort to try to impede Chinese economic development by things like demanding intellectual property rights. Do you see any discussion of this?
Not in the mainstream media that I can...
I mean, of course, you can find some. Dean Baker, a good economist, he writes about it. But it's basically off the agenda.
Now, since one would assume that, since America isn't exceptional, except sometimes maybe exceptionally bad in certain cases, but what's happened, but is the reverse happening? I mean, and how does the United States respond? I mean, I assume other countries are trying to do the same thing in the United States, impede economic progress in the United States. It's rational.
There's a couple of things wrong with the concept of American exceptionalism. One is the facts. Okay.
Yeah.
The other is it's not American.
Yeah.
Every great power has had the same exceptionalism. Britain, when it was virtually genocidal all over the world, was praising itself on its magnificence.
Sure. I mean,
France had the civilized mission. Well, the French Minister of War was calling on the army to exterminate the population of Algeria. If we had records from Attila the Hun, he would probably be just overwhelmed with good.
The fact that every country has thought that they've been the unique source of goodness and because of their powers.
There's nothing exceptional about American exceptionalism.
Well, but since it isn't exceptional, what about is the reverse? You give me examples. Are other countries? I mean, other countries are trying to assumedly impede American economic progress, and what's the response here?
How can they impede American economics?
Well, I guess I mean, let me give you. I'm not an economist. My ignorance is going to show here, but I'm assuming, for example,
know better than to accept specialist judgments.
Yeah, I know exactly. But I mean, to some extent, China can impede American progress by being able to produce the same goods and services much more cheaply.
But who's producing them in China? U.S. corporations who want to function work in China.
Yeah.
If U.S. corporations don't like Chinese rules, they can invest somewhere else.
By the way, there was an article in today's New York Times that said exactly that, right? It was the response to some of the pressure from Trump, one might say, I don't know if you saw this article, but it was basically saying there's some impact to what's going on, and some companies are stopping having made things in China, but what they're doing is not bringing it back to the United States. They're just finding another place to do it.
Yeah.
Which is,
But the idea that it's unfair for China to impose technology transfer restrictions or partial ownership restrictions on, say, Boeing, it's not a question of national policy. If Boeing doesn't like that, nobody's forcing them to invest there.
Yeah.
Okay. So what right do we have to punish them for trying to do that? Quite apart from the fact that that's how we developed, how England developed, how everybody developed.
Okay, let's hit some other hot button issues. Well, we won't spend the whole time on foreign policy because I want to, as in our last dialogue, I want to cover a broad area.
Okay.
And I want to do it around books, actually. So I started with Emerson just for fun, but let's hit North Korea. I think I'd like to talk about North Korea, Syria a little bit, and maybe Brazil because we were talking about it. And interestingly enough, I think because it's something that I haven't read about before, and so that may be my ignorance. But anyway, so what about North Korea?
Well, actually, Trump is not my favorite person, as you know.
Yeah.
But on North Korea, basically, I think he's doing the right things. And he's attacked for it on all sides. Whenever he does something more or less right, why, I don't know. Maybe he's shooting arrows randomly, and
monkeys
some
on
of
the
them hit the
typewriter
target.
every now and then they get it right.
Whatever the reasons
Yeah.
are. But let's take a look at North Korea on just the recent history. April 27th, I think it was, 2017, the two Koreas met and negotiated and issued a very serious document, a historic document, Panmunjom Declaration. Very serious. In fact, a good article about it in Foreign Affairs, of all places.
Yeah.
For the first time, they not only made rhetorical commitments towards denuclearization, towards integration, and as Foreign Affairs pointed out, made concrete proposals. Here, we'll do it step by step. And then it said the two Koreas will do this on their own accord, crucially.
Yeah.
On their own accord, meaning leave us alone. We know who they're talking to.
Yeah.
Okay. Trump is the one leading figure, for whatever reason, who's more or less observed this. The Singapore summit, for which Trump was bitterly denounced by the liberals, the conservatives, by everyone, he basically said, well, you guys go ahead on your own accord.
Yeah, I mean,
he even took steps towards reducing what he recognized to be provocative military operations, American military operations in South Korea. Remember what's going on. In these operations, the U.S. is flying nuclear-capable aircraft bombers right at the border of a country that the U.S. wiped out, literally wiped out, back in the early 50s. I mean, by the time the war settled into a kind of a stalemate, what was happening was the U.S. was bombing massively. They couldn't find any more targets. You read the official Air Force history. They describe how, well, nothing to bomb, we'll just bomb the dams, which is a huge war crime.
Yeah.
And then it discusses how, it's interesting to read, how euphoric they were about bombing this huge dam, and a massive flood of water is swamping all this area, and Asians, a little bit of racism, they depend on rice, and they're fleeing and they're screaming and so on. This is the country that we're now flying nuclear bombers right on their border. So yes, it is provocative. And Trump said, well, let's cut back some of this. I mean, I'm not saying what he said was wonderful, but it's basically in the right direction.
Well, except what he says and what he does are not always exactly the same. I mean, the one thing, it's interesting to me that after all this bluster, the foreign policy is somewhat coming back to what might have been considered more realistic. I mean, there's still the last dialogue broke off because once again the United States said, unless you totally disarm, we're not going to reduce sanctions, which just seems to me to be completely unrealistic.
Well, that's, I think, I don't know the inside story, but it looks like Pompeo and Bolton.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems as if Trump's instinct was to say, well, go ahead, but he was kind of pushed. And remember, he's under attack from all sides.
Yeah.
The liberals attack him even more sharply as the Hawks. But as I say, of all the major political actors here, he seems on this issue to be the one who's closest to being what I would regard as taking the same position, letting the two Koreas proceed on their own accord as they've asked to.
And I think that's what's going to, in my own opinion, I disagree, is that's what, if this quote-unquote crisis is going to resolve itself, it's going to happen to some extent internally if we allow it to be the case.
That's the way to, the only hope.
North Korea is going to
powers cannot help.
Yeah, and North Korea, I think, recognizes that greater alliances with South Korea will be beneficial to it, and South Korea...
Well, I think President Moon is following a pretty reasonable path.
Let's say, okay, since you mentioned the T word, we'll come back to foreign, but let's talk about Trump, because of course that's all anyone seems to talk about. And discussions of Trump dominate all everything else. We don't hear about any other issues. And I wanted, maybe we can talk about that a little bit.
Well, Trump is a very effective con man. He's gotta praise him for his achievements.
Yeah.
Narrow set of skills, but he's using them very effectively. He's got the major media completely wrapped around his little finger. He manipulates them totally. One crazy thing after another, they talk about that, then they say it doesn't make any sense, and everybody's forgotten because he's on to the next one. So one day it's let's eliminate the whole health system. Everybody attacks that. And 2 days later he says let's stop all traffic across the Mexican border, which of course would shut down the economy. Everyone points that out. And then the next day it'll be something else. Meanwhile, he's carrying out a very effective job. You probably saw the article in the New York Times a couple days ago about how he's totally taken over the Republican Party from top to bottom. It's now his party. And remember, 2 years ago, the Republican establishment hated him.
Yeah.
Okay, now he's taken over the whole party, and he's carrying out something pretty. First of all, this should not be much of a surprise. If you look back the last 10 or 15 years, even a little beyond, during the neoliberal period since basically Reagan, both parties have shifted to the right. The Democrats are kind of what used to be called moderate Republicans. The Republicans have just gone off the edge. Norman Ornstein, Thomas Mann of American Enterprise Institute described them plausibly as a radical insurgency, which has given up parliamentary politics.
Yeah, I mean, the healthcare plan that now is, in Reagan's time, would have been Reagan.
Way off. Like if you read Eisenhower now, he sounds like Bernie Sanders almost. I mean, we've gone so far, literally. Okay, so what's happened?
Even Barry
The
Goldwater.
Republicans are both parties are essentially business parties, but the Republicans, just with abject subordination to wealth and corporate power, can't get votes that way. So they've been forced to try to mobilize constituencies, which in the past weren't really major political constituencies, and to try to get them to be the base of the party on what are called ridiculously cultural issues. So gun rights, abortion, religious fanaticism, xenophobia, whatever it may be. And this has been showing up in the primaries for quite a while. So over the past years, in every Republican primary, when somebody comes up from the base, they're out of, they're way out of the outfield. Michelle Bachmann, Rick Santorum.
Exactly.
And the establishment has been able to crush them, get their Mitt Romney types. The difference in 2016 was they couldn't crush him. This time, the crazy guy from the outfield got in. Now, the base, he's got the base behind him, and he's controlling them, and he's carrying out a very effective policy. How much he understands what he's doing, I have no idea. Maybe it's just megalomania, but
likely.
He's got two constituencies he's got to keep supporting him. The primary constituency is the one of the Republican Party, the very rich, the corporate sector. So we hand that task over to Mitch McConnell, Paul Ryan, and ram through the legislation, which stuffs pockets with even more dollars and shafts everyone else, and so on. Now, that's going beautifully. The rich and the corporations have profits zooming. They don't know what to do with them. Trillions of dollars they can't spend. The wealthy are doing magnificently. The tax scam, the one legislative achievement, we don't have to talk about it. So that's one constituency. Meanwhile, you've got to control the voting base. How do you do that? Throw them a little red meat, build a wall, keep out the rapists and murderers, shift, love Israel, shift the embassy for the evangelicals, one thing after another. He's carrying it off. The base adores him while they're getting shafted.
I mean, that's always been the remarkable thing, is how people can always vote against their own.
But it's doing very well. And what are the Democrats doing? Helping him. Like
Exactly.
the focus on the Miller investigation, which was tactically crazy, was obvious from the beginning that if anything's going to come out of that, it'll be that Trump was trying to build a hotel in the Red Square or something, some minor corruption.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that in retrospect. I've been saying it for a long time. What they've done now is probably maybe even hand Trump the 2020 election by just, instead of the real issues, like, hey, you're destroying the environment for future life. You're building up your nuclear posture review is greatly extending the likelihood of total catastrophe. You're pouring money into the pockets of the super rich and issuing regulations and executive orders and legislation which is harming the working class and everyone else. Instead of that, Trump is going to, Mueller's going to show that the Russians interfered with the election and you helped. You know, the Russians couldn't. I mean, if the Russians interfered with the elections, it was undetectable. I mean, it's trivial. I mean, there is, after all, massive interference with the elections. Like they're bought. Okay. You can predict the outcome of Tom Ferguson's work is the main work on this. You
Showing you there's this correlation.
That, what he called the investment theory of politics, with remarkable precision way back, right through 2016. You can predict electability for the executive and Congress simply with the single variable of campaign spending, and that's just the beginning. You know, is that interference with elections? Well, yeah, it means that as very good work in the academic political science shows, most of the population is literally unrepresented. Their own representatives pay no attention to their preferences. They listen to other voices.
Do you think the Supreme Court decision in that regard, in terms of money spent on elections, was significantly changed it or not?
It's changed, but it's changed something that already existed.
Yeah, it certainly is.
You go back to 1895. Mark Hanna, who was the famous campaign manager, was asked once, "What does it take to run an effective campaign?" He said there are two things. The first thing is money, and I've forgotten what the second one is. That was 1895. Of course, the recent decisions, Buckley Valley and Citizens United, have enhanced that enormously, but it goes way back.
Well, the other thing that, so we're talking about history and statements, and I forget whether it was Goering or Goebbels who said that if you want to get people to do what you want them to do, it doesn't matter whether you have a democracy or dictatorship, just make them afraid. And that seems to also, in some sense, being affected. I mean, this whole notion of immigrants being the greatest danger facing the United States, the opposite of most of American history, in fact, I'm finding it kind of amazing to see how effective it works. It works. Yeah.
I mean, and again, there's a long history. Hofstadter talked about anti-intellectualism.
Yeah.
Another kind of striking feature of American culture from way back is that although this is the most secure country in the world by any objective standard,
lucky to have oceans around
it, probably the most frightened.
Yeah.
It's a very frightened country. That lies behind, partly, there's a lot more, but it's one of the things that lies behind this kind of crazed gun culture. Why do you have to have 25 assault rifles in your closet? They're coming after me. You know, I got to protect myself.
Yeah, well, it comes, and again, it's an issue that I hope we're going to get when we come back in some sense. That, but you know, this recent book by John Haidt and others about the coddling of the American mind have argued that level of being frightened, it affects people's behavior on a micro scale as well. The notion that every time your kids leave the house, they're in danger, and they should never be in danger and never be in risk, somehow comes into the notion that they should never be uncomfortable. They shouldn't be uncomfortable in school. They shouldn't hear ideas they don't want to. Everything is a threat, and it is true. I think that I remember when I spent a year in Switzerland when at CERN when my daughter was younger. My daughter was, I remember, at 8 or 9 or 10, and she was really afraid of going outside the house on her own in living where we lived at the time. And it was remarkable to see when she was in Switzerland that, you know, I would drive my car and I'd suddenly see her and her friends downtown. And so this notion of every time you leave the house, the world is terrifying really does seem to be an American kind
and
of...
it's recent. I mean, when I was a kid in the 30s and early 40s, I lived in Philadelphia.
Yeah.
When I was maybe 12 years old, I used to take the train by myself to New York and spend the day walking around anarchist bookstores, and my parents didn't know what I was doing.
That was the problem. That was there. You see, if they just controlled you.
But it was not considered anything like that.
I grew up in Canada, but it was still the same for me. In Toronto, I used to take the subway car downtown to see baseball games.
We moved into the suburbs when my kids were little, and this place, you can't imagine a place that's more safe. Kids were playing in the streets. They'd go into each other's houses and so on. You go to the same neighborhood now, you don't see a child. Either they're inside looking at video games or they're being driven somewhere for organized activities.
Yeah.
Kids, it's been, in fact, studied. Children don't know how to play spontaneously. Everything has to be controlled. They have to be watched all the time. If they're, somewhere maybe in, Oregon, a kid got kidnapped, everything in the country has to close down.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, the dangers back in the 30s and 40s were far greater, but it just wasn't an issue.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting.
But this business of Trump knows what he's doing when he builds up fear of the rapists and murderers and Islamic terrorists. Just to give you an example, a couple of weeks ago, Steve Bannon, is kind of Rasputin, came down to Arizona, where we live in Tucson, and there was a meeting. He ran a meeting at a very luxurious gated community south of Tucson, not too far from the border. Guards, gates, very rich, and so on. He had a lot of nice people there, like Chris Kobach, this guy who's trying to keep people from voting.
Yes.
So there was a good report of it in kind of a independent Tucson newspaper, Tucson Sentinel, had a reporter there. The goal of the meeting was to try to raise private money to build the wall, because Congress is run by communists. They're not going to do anything. So all these super rich people are pitching in money to build the wall. But the discussions were interesting. People were describing how frightened they are. I mean, if there's anybody in the world safer than them, I don't know how you'd find them.
Yeah.
But these are people who are frightened. We got to protect ourselves. In fact, there was one legislator there who said, I'm not only in favor of the wall, I think we ought to have a wall from the border right along the Arizona border against California all the way up to the Canadian border, because these people are going to come in from California. We got to protect ourselves. And not only maybe we need an army to protect us around the gated community, but and when Trump talks to the public, at least according to the reports that come up, people resonate.
Yeah, no, it really works effectively. I never know with Trump whether it's an accident or whether he's whether he really knows what he's doing, or whether he just latches on by luck to an issue that seems to resonate and he uses it and then pick it up. He just tests the water.
But he's doing that But meanwhile, you have to remember that his primary constituency, corporate power and the wealthy, he's serving them with real dedication.
Would you say that in terms of, I don't want to harp on this too much, but in terms of the greatest danger, if there is one, of Trump being president, many people feel that the fact that he's a loose cannon, the fact that he does no reading, no knowledge about details about the world around, or certainly doesn't read or listen to his advisors, would you say that's a bigger danger than the fact that effectively he's apparently implementing underneath all the noise an agenda that you worry about, or not?
I mean, there's a lot of dangers with Trump. The worst one, which overwhelms everything else, is the dedication to destroy the environment. Yeah. I mean, that just swamps everything else. That ought to be a screaming headline every day.
Well, I'm surprised that if if private money wanted to build the wall, 8.6 billion is not a lot of money that could easily be done. I mean, more than that spent on elections. But interestingly enough, when you put it in perspective, talking about the environment and talking about progress, 8.6 billion, which is what he's asking for the wall, is more than the entire amount, the entire budget of the National Science Foundation. I mean, if it talks about what is better for our security in the future,
how about the subsidies to the fossil fuel industry?
Which is much bigger than that.
How about the subsidies to the financial institutions? There's some good technical studies, IMF and others, who point out that the financial institutions, which are pretty much predatory, they barely help the economy, they may harm it, and they're a huge part of the economy.
They're huge.
They are maintained effectively by public subsidy, by the implicit government insurance policy, which raises their credit ratings, gives them access to cheap money. When you count all of that, it's pretty much their profits. I mean, compared with this, the wall and the National Science Foundation aren't even visible.
Yeah. No, it's interesting to think about that. I mean, and similarly, when we come to the climate change
that's the two things that ought to be emphasized by the political opposition, if there were one, are this dedicated commitment to destroy the prospects for organized human life within a short period, and the radical intensification of the already extremely dangerous military confrontation.
I was going to hit that those, I know that from our discussions, those are the two biggest challenges.
I think there's another danger that we shouldn't forget. I was personally very relieved when the Mueller investigation didn't come up with much, because if they had come up with something that really implicates Trump, we would have been in deep trouble. I mean, he's a narcissistic megalomaniac. He's kind of like the magician behind the curtain in The Wizard of Oz. He knows that it's a very thin cover. If anything breaks, he could go for broke. There's plenty that he could do.
Yeah, but I know people are worried about what, and I don't know who said it, in fact, that well, maybe it was James Comey, not someone who's I agree with all the time, but that he was worried that exactly that would happen, and it would lead to some kind of, and there'd be violence that would.
Well, he's already indicated his dog whistling is worth listening to. So take his attacks on John McCain, which people are wondering why is he attacking John McCain? Well, there's a very good article on this by Bruce Franklin, very good analyst, who's also the leading specialist on the POW mythology. There's a lot of the country still believes that the North Koreans, the North Vietnamese are holding all sorts of American POWs, and it's a terrible thing. And McCain is one of their villains because he's part of the myth is that he's the one who sold people out and helped keep our brave American boys there. Rambo has to go in and rescue them and so on. That's a pretty big thing in a sector of the country that Trump openly talks to. When he talks about how his bikers are tough guys and they're going to really cause trouble, that's who he's talking to. When he attacks McCain, he's talking to them. He's throwing them the red meat. This is clever politics and very dangerous. This is a very violent country. There are militias all over, probably better armed than the National Guard. A lot of desperate, angry people. People have been hit by the stagnation of the neoliberal period. There's economic distress. There's concern that somehow the white population is, as they put it, facing genocide, meaning we might not be a majority in a couple of decades. All of this is very real. And when these dog whistling attacks on McCain and the hints about the Mexican rapists overcoming us and destroying us, all of that's talking to a sector of the population that's very real, is under a kind of distress, stemming largely back from economic policies that right at the top that are creating the kinds of situation which we now are. There's something similar in Europe. All of this converges. And when you get this, again, narcissistic megalomaniac who's a clever politician sitting right at the top of it and pulling the strings, it's a fragile system, but it's working and very dangerous.
Okay, well, since we're on an uplifting area, let me try and think of any buttons we haven't pushed yet before we move on. And I think we probably should push this button at least once. So let's talk about Syria and Israel for a little bit and see if we can alienate the part of the public we haven't so far. So Syria, Israel.
Well, Syria is a total disaster. The country's been virtually destroyed. We can look at the history, but here again, I'm afraid I disagree with many of my friends on the left on this. One of the Trump proposals was to leave a small contingent of troops in a sector of northern Syria, which is mostly Kurdish.
The Kurdish, yeah.
I think that's a good idea. Anti-interventionists just block out on this. We've got to take them out. They have no right to be there, and so on. But think it through for a second. The Turkish army military is carrying out, again, it's done worse before, serious atrocities against Kurds in Turkey itself and in the areas of Syria that they have occupied, recently Afrin. If they move on to Raqqa, the other mostly Kurdish areas, that'll just continue. What's stopping them? Small contingent of U.S. troops which are confined to the Syrian areas and are not intervening elsewhere in Syrian affairs. I don't like U.S. troops to be anywhere, but in this case, I think it's not out of humanitarian goals, whatever the goals may be. It may be helping to avert a serious catastrophe. I think those are things that are worth thinking about, not just kind of an axiom that says, get them out, get the troops home, period. You have to think about what the meaning is. It's not like a justification for humanitarian intervention, which is always a fraud.
Yeah.
This is a matter of assessing the actual situation that exists.
Independent of intentions, whether it has a good impact.
Nothing to do with intentions. It's those we can put aside. The intentions we know. I mean, up until under Obama, until about 2015, the U.S. and its allies, incidentally, France, England, were believed that it would be possible to overthrow the Assad regime, and were committed to doing so. Finally, I think it was around 2013, 2014, the U.S., the CIA sent advanced anti-tank missiles to the opposition, which by then is mostly jihadi run, which did stop the Syrian army advance. Predictably, the Russians intervened with more force, started sending the Air Force, took out the TOW missiles, Assad army went on. At that point, pretty much the West accepted the fact that, like it or not, this monster, and he is a monster, will probably control most of the country. And since then, whatever planning or negotiations are taking place are mostly out of the West's hands. It's Russia, Iran, Syria are pretty much running the show, like it or not. And there's not a lot that the U.S. can do about that, even if it should. But with regard to Israel, there's a lot to say about this, but the support, what's called the support for Israel here, is very reminiscent of old-fashioned Stalinism. It's extraordinary when you look into it, up to the level of books published by university presses, which are just full of outlandish lies and fabrications, denouncing anybody, me of course, who dares to raise a minor criticism about the Holy State. The level of lying is spectacular. Could go into examples, but it's not worth it.
Okay, go on. But
it's not even worth talking about that. But there's a kind of a desperate effort now on the part of those who supported the call themselves supporters of Israel. I don't think that's the right term. I think they're supporters of Israel's moral degeneration and maybe ultimate destruction, but that's another story. Who call themselves supporters of Israel since the 1970s have increasingly been finding their backs to the wall because public opinion is changing strikingly, especially among younger people. Polls are very clear. Even personal experience is very clear. So like up till maybe 10 years ago, if I gave a talk about Israel-Palestine at a university, even my own university, I had to have police protection. The police had to follow me out to my car because meetings were broken up. Nobody was worrying about free speech at universities.
Yeah, well, we'll get to that. Yeah,
this is an issue
that's changed.
That's changed. In fact, among people who identify themselves as liberal Democrats, actually support for Palestinian rights is even higher than Israel at this point. Support for Israel has gone to the most reactionary parts of the population. Evangelical Christians, xenophobes. The Democratic Party used to be the base for support for Israel. It still is, but nothing like the Republicans. They're extreme. Trump, of course, is.
But but at the same time, with a recent discussion about the Golan Heights, I read it and I heard that there was some concern, but then I didn't see any big outcry.
Well, it's pretty interesting. The Golan Heights have been recognized internationally, including the United States, as occupied territory. The U.S. supported the Security Council resolutions declaring that Israeli efforts to take over the Heights, and in particular their annexation of the Heights, which they did, is absolutely illegal, has no basis in international law, can't be accepted. That was true up until Trump. A couple of weeks ago, he just reversed it. Okay, now they're allowed to take it over. Anybody talking about it?
No, that's why I was amazed. I mean, people mention it, and then I never really saw much of an outcry about it after.
They say, well, maybe it's not tactically good, might alienate somebody. Then the idea is, well, Israel needs this for its defense. This is outlandish. I mean, the Israeli military overwhelms everyone in the area combined, They're quite apart from the fact that they have a big nuclear arsenal. But they're the military force in the region.
Yeah.
One of the major. The Golan Heights, it's not defense. They want it because it's nice territory. You have it's economic. It's a very nice area. You have the skis on the Mount Hermon. Build agricultural communities. A nice place to visit and live. They want it. Okay. There's no military threat there.
People always say, I suppose it's a buffer. Right?
When people say Hezbollah is at their border, Hezbollah is not an insignificant military force, but the only respect in which they're a threat to Israel, the only respect, is if Israel attacks Lebanon, they'll fight back. And that is a threat to Israel. So in fact, if Israel were to proceed with its occasionally announced plans to attack Iran, probably the first thing they do is wipe out Lebanon, just to prevent the deterrence of Hezbollah missiles. So yes, that's a threat, if you like. We might ask the same question about what the Iranian threat is supposed to be. Who is Iran threatening? Suppose Iran had nuclear weapons. Where's the threat? If they dared to arm a missile with nuclear weapons, the country would be wiped out.
It's
in fact, U.S. intelligence is pretty clear about this. If you look at their presentations to Congress over many years, they've pointed out that basic picture is that Iran has very low military expenditures by the standards of the region, let alone the United States. But its strategic posture is defensive, trying to set up to ensure that it can react to aggression sufficiently so diplomacy will take over.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. Of course, if you want to support the show, you can do so by going to www.patreon.com and getting a membership for as little as $3 a month. Again, that's www.patreon.com/The Jerome McClain Show. The Jerome McClain Show is fully listener-supported, independent media that won't lead you to tribalism. Get a membership and support independent media at www.patreon.com/The Jerome McClain Show.